Hello everyone and welcome to Off the Cuff, where the headlines come to life. And today we are so honored to have in the studio Senator David Knezek, who is a lifelong Dearborn Heights resident. He told me to make sure I mentioned that. And he represents the 5th District in the Michigan Senate. So it's always an honor and a pleasure to have you here.
Appreciate it. Thanks for having me back.
You do some amazing things, and you really redefine the word politician, because you're really out there for the people and by the people. And I say that with utmost conviction, because I've seen what you've done and I've seen who you stand up to, and I absolutely love it.
Thank you. That's so nice of you to say. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. And your run in the Senate has not been sort of in the shadows. You have been out there, you've been talking, you've been making changes, and a lot of the different changes that you've proposed is a real huge one coming up in terms of voting, and who can vote and who can't vote. And we were just talking off camera about giving rights to somebody might be taking rights away from another person, but you said that, or you're fighting for 16-year-olds to actually be able to vote. So what was your inspiration for that? And I guess maybe critics would say, are 16-year-olds ready to vote, and do they know the issues?
Sure. No, and I like this issue because it has really spurred a lot of conversation. Certainly some people that agree with it, some people that disagree with it. All I want to do is to start that conversation. And so when I look out across the United States and come right back here to my own hometown, or I'm at Crestwood High School, at Annapolis, at Robichaud, and I'm talking with students who are 16 or older. They're old enough to go off and work. They're old enough to go off and pay taxes. In the case of 17-year-olds, they're old enough to join the military and serve our country overseas. And they can do just about everything to take part in our political process. They can knock doors, they can make phone calls, they can attend events, but they just can't walk into the voting booth and pull that voting lever, if you will. So I started a conversation in Lansing about what would it look like if we were to expand the pool of who was allowed to vote. And so there was some immediate pushback that came from some folks who asked that question. Is a 16-year-old old enough to make that decision for themselves? And what I point out is that
or maybe mature enough.
Right.
Might be the word.
Well, I think the maturity question is probably a slippery slope, right? Because after any national sporting event, I could find you name how many, 30, 40, 50, 60-year-olds in the streets, lighting things on fire, knocking down street signs, flipping over cars. Nobody questions their maturity or whether or not they would have that right to vote. And so for me, the maturity question isn't necessarily the strongest argument against it. So sometimes folks will talk about brain development and brain function. And from a psychological standpoint and a brain development standpoint, we know that frontal lobe is not fully developed until the age of 25. No one's talking about increasing the voting age to 25. And so for me, it really comes back to what are we doing to increase access to the voting booth. And that's sort of been a theme through other legislation that I've done in the past about absentee voting, about the lines that we have at the voting booth. What can we do to make it easier for people to have access to have a say in who their government is? The government they're helping fund, they should have a say in who that government is. And so when you look at 16-year-olds who will go to vote for the first time with a parent, who get into the habits at an early age, it not only increases the likelihood that they participate in their first election, but it drastically increases the likelihood that they'll continue to participate in elections. Absolutely. Throughout the entire arc of their lifetime. And so, this is an argument that I have with young people all the time. I turn 32 next month. I was the youngest member of the Senate. I lost it for a second, but I'm going to get it back come January. We have, I think, just as much at stake as anybody within our political system today, but we don't participate at the levels that we need to. And one of the ways that I think that you can change that is by instilling it in people at a younger age, the importance of it, and giving them the ability to go in and participate in that process itself. So for me, this is not a partisan issue in any way. I want young Democrats and young Republicans to be able to go in and have a say in who's representing them in their government. Because what we've seen today on a number of different issues, the people who are in elected office are not representing the actual interests of the people that they were elected to represent. You could talk about issues of schools, of roads, of guns, you name it. And we know the data, we know the numbers of American citizens who feel so strongly about these issues, but the people who are in Washington or in Lansing are just sitting on their hands, coming up with any number of excuses to not take action. I think a great way to bring about that action is, as the old saying goes, throw the bums out. And so if they're not doing the job, if they're not doing the job that we elected them to do, we need to hold them accountable. And increasing access to the voting booth, I think, is a great way to do that.
You know, when we had the horrific shootings within the schools, young people actually took it into their own hands and created a lot of awareness. And I'm sure a lot of them were 16-year-olds and 15-year-olds and, you know, what have you. But I think you're absolutely right. And I never really thought about it, you know, that way. I always thought, you know, as a 16-year-old, really, do they know the issues? But how many adults know the issues when they go in and vote?
Sure.
Looking at our last election, without getting myself in trouble here, you know, and I think having, you know, that huge pool of young kids who are seeing what's going on, and you're going to get the passionate people out there. I mean, not every 16-year-old is going to be, you know, feel like they have that duty, but to give them that opportunity, I think is really golden. And as you said, it expands that voting pool where, you know, you have, you know, kids who are really passionate can voice their opinion and not say, well, we're stuck with this because look what the adults gave us.
Right.
So,
right.
And talking about that, this morning was very interesting. Our president went to tweeting.
Sure.
Once again, and I think he threatened Iran, which was, I don't think there's anything to read between the lines. He was very vivid. You know, be cautious. You know, we won't take this. You know, you're going to suffer. How does that kind of communication with world leaders on tweets really, you know, affect? If I was a 16-year-old, I'd be afraid. I'm afraid now because I look at that and I think, okay, you know, who's running the country here? Who's running the world? You know, how is this communication going to be positive, and how do you see it, and how does that affect what's going on here in Michigan?
Yeah, no, and I feel pretty strongly about some of these issues surrounding foreign affairs and international relations. Obviously, having been in the military myself and served abroad.
Right, you served in Iraq for a while.
Yeah, 2 tours. Yeah.
Right.
And so, you know, when you know, you're conducting diplomacy over Twitter, you know, I mean, really, that's an issue for not just us as citizens, but certainly for members of the military as well.
Sure.
Because
that's scary.
Very scary. Because at the end of the day, it's about safety, their security. And when the president is doing things that's not in consultation with the State Department, his other advisors, ambassadors, members of the military, the generals, the whole 9 yards, when he runs off on his own program, that leaves everybody else in the dark and at a loss for what to do and how to respond. I'm not saying I don't want the president to be tough or to defend our country or to defend our values. I want every American president to do that. But what I want them to do is to do it in a responsible way.
There's a difference between being tough and being a bully.
Sure. And frankly, you know, President Trump has a very long history of pointing out that he believes that any president should attack or could attack Iran as a way of deflecting from certain domestic issues that they're having here at home. And so after years of him using that to attack other presidents, to see him now doing it himself, it tells us, what is the president trying to distract us from happening, or from what's happening here at home? And so, again, for me, the same thing with North Korea. You know, having the conversation, that's fine.
What was that?
But there's ways that you go about these negotiations, especially on an international scale. And you have to read the briefings. You have to understand the world leaders that you're working with, whether it's Rouhani in Iran or Kim Jong-un in North Korea or Vladimir Putin in Russia. We know how these individuals
There's protocol.
Act.
There's definitely protocol, and I think the atmosphere in our country right now is there is no protocol. There's just a whim that happens, and then it's acted upon, and then a tweet comes out.
Yeah.
And you look at that and you go, who's steering here.
And I'd rather just get it right the first time, right? I wish we didn't have to say something, or our president wouldn't say something, and then we have to have round one of the retractions followed by a retraction of the retractions. For me, I just like to get it right the first time, so that there's no gray area.
But you're absolutely right. A lot of this is distraction, and the media is actually talking about, okay, what are they throwing at us to distract us with, and what are the real issues, and is he that clever? I don't know. I think the jury's still out on that.
Sure.
But you talk about elections, and you talk about protocol, and you talk about things being in place, and we're always talking about redistricting and redrawing those boundaries in regards to who can vote where and what have you, and separating the populations again in red and blue. So how is that affecting us right now? And we're doing it again.
Yeah, so the redistricting process, as you know, and I'm sure for the folks at home, every 0 year, 2000, 2010, we conduct the census across the state. In the 1 year immediately following, they redraw all the district lines, and then in the 2 year following that, we go out and we have these new elections using these new district boundaries. The problem with that process is that it's currently elected officials in Lansing who are responsible for drawing those lines. And so what you find, and this is regardless of political party, what you find is that these individuals in office will draw the lines to benefit them as opposed to what's in the best interest of their constituents. And so what we say in that process is that when we talk about voting, when we talk about participating in that process, we always think of it as voters selecting who their politicians are. But when we allow politicians to draw those district lines, we allow the politicians to pick who their voters are. And so what happens is, in a district like mine, for example, my Senate district was drawn in 2011. I wasn't elected to that seat until 2014, but I currently represent an 85% Democratic district. So for a majority of districts like mine across the state of Michigan, once you get past that August primary, there's very little to no competition from either side, because you know that it's a foregone conclusion.
Right.
So if you look at the Michigan House of Representatives, 110 seats, 100 of those seats are almost a foregone conclusion on Election Day. And all that time, all the energy, all the money, the unfortunate influx of all that money is focused on these 10 seats across the entire state. So what happened a year ago is an organization called Voters Not Politicians went out and gathered enough signatures, over 300,000 signatures, to put onto the ballot whether or not we wanted to take that redistricting process out of the hands of elected officials and put it into the hands of a nonpartisan redistricting commission. They had enough votes, they had enough signatures. They had it authorized to be put on the ballot this November. And just 2 weeks ago, a lawsuit was filed to try and kick them off of the ballot. That lawsuit's gone immediately in front of the state Supreme Court. They just had a hearing last week, took oral arguments on that. And so it's this question of, when you talk about amending the Constitution, there is sort of legal precedent that talks about how much of the Constitution can be considered amending, until you get into this concept of, we're not just amending the Constitution, we're completely rewriting it. Right? And so the question here is, because they are inserting 13 new sections and deleting X number of old sections, is that more than just a simple amendment to the Constitution? Is that something that requires a constitutional convention? And so on one hand, to be forthright with you, there are people and there are entities and groups out there that want this kicked off the ballot, because they know that if this goes to an independent commission, we're going to have districts that accurately represent the people of this state.
Right.
And so there are a lot of special interests who don't want that to happen. That's why they're filing this lawsuit. If that gets kicked off the ballot, what I think is going to backfire is that the people not only who volunteered for that effort, but people who support that effort are just going to be incensed, because they see good public policy, and good public policy that's helping the people of this state getting thrown aside because a special interest wants it to be that way, and that's not right. And so the blowback may be that you motivate this large chunk of people as a result of trying to kick that off the ballot.
Wow, that's sounds a little diabolical.
It is diabolical. It is diabolical.
Goodness. Well, you look at things across the board, and you look at our politics, and you look at the way things are being run, and the different loopholes, that are being taken in to really obstruct justice and obstruct our voting process. And it's like, what do you do? How do you make sure that you're represented in the right way, and you're voting for the right person, and that person is going into office because the people want them to be there to be their voice. So again, the jury's out on that too.
Literally in this case, yeah.
Yeah. You actually went against one of your colleagues, who was really, in my opinion, you have to sort of call a spade, really spewing hate, and you stood up to that, and I know that you got a little bit of flack in doing that as well, but you don't, like I said, you don't shy away from those things. You do what's right, and you put it on the table. Tell us about that. It was with Senator Patrick Colbeck, and he made statements in regarding the Muslim community, and very derogatory statements. And you stood up, and you said, "Wait a minute, this isn't right." So tell us about that.
It's not funny, but I laugh because Senator Colbeck and I have had more than our fair share of go-arounds with each other over the last few years.
Yeah, a couple more here.
And in this particular instance, the senator was going around the state. He's currently running for governor, talking about Muslim students who are a part of the Muslim Students Association, the same way that we have other organizations on college campuses. I think of when I was at U of M Dearborn, the variety of groups we had, and saying that they're all tied to terrorist organizations. Not to say one or some, that they all are. And to talk about Abdul El-Sayed, who is running for governor right now, and saying that because he's Muslim and because he has that sort of history of that faith in his family, he's tied to extremist and terrorist organizations. And to me, it was
further from the truth.
Yeah, for the record, couldn't be further from the truth.
These allegations are just for their own convenience.
It's to me, it's frustrating. It speaks to sort of the type of politics that we have in our country today, where Senator Colbeck is just looking for that red meat to throw to his base, to get them fired up and angry about something. And you find that with so many of my colleagues today, and that's that they would rather use these tactics of divisiveness as a way of advancing their own agenda, instead of looking for the things that really unite us and make our community strong.
Or
and
basically the truth.
That too. Yeah,
that sometimes works.
The truth is a four-letter word for some of my colleagues. So for me, it was just it frustrates me because I'm always pretty forthright when it comes to talking about whether it's religion or race. I think these are important conversations to have. I don't think that by not talking about it, it makes it better or it goes away. I actually think it makes it worse and allows these issues to sort of fester under the surface until they boil over and really become a negative for everybody. And so when somebody is from out county or northern Michigan, if they have closed-minded views about people of a different race or a different ethnicity, I don't get angry about that because I know that they've never had any exposure to somebody who's different than them. What I see that as is an educational opportunity to say, I understand why you think that. Give me the opportunity to show you the other side of the coin. Give me the opportunity to expose you to people or a faith or ethnicity that you just don't have any interactions with. And what you find 9 times out of 10 is people lose that sense of closed-mindedness, because when you humanize somebody, when you put a face to it, it's not just what you heard about on the radio or saw, or saw on, absolutely, or saw on TV. And so, those are situations that I can tolerate and work to change. What frustrates me is when you have somebody like Senator Colbeck, who lives in Canton, who has a very large Muslim community in Canton, who lives next to the largest Muslim communities in the United States here in Dearborn and Dearborn Heights, and to pretend to be ignorant towards that, to me, is just very frustrating. And so I had the opportunity to just call him to the carpet on it and say, if you're going to say it, say it to our face. If you really feel that way, say it in front of God and country. And he wouldn't do it. In fact, he stormed off the Senate floor and refused to stand by his words. But I always end those interactions, and they can be, intense at times, but I always end them with an invitation. Come to the district, sit down, meet some people, just have a conversation. Even if your views don't change, I at least want to know that you're willing to make a good faith effort to educate and understand yourself. And those politics of divisiveness and using fear as a motivator to try and get things done, in our government today, is one of the reasons why we're having the problems that we have. Certainly, there are differences between Christians and Muslims and Jews, and differences in experiences for white Americans, black Americans, Arab Americans. But when it comes to matters of faith, I personally believe that there's far more that we have in common,
absolutely,
than it is that we have in difference. And so I try to find those commonalities and to acknowledge the fact that these differences, we're not better off as a state or better as a country in spite of those differences. I think that we're better because of those differences. And for me, it's always an important narrative to push in the legislature.
And golden words spoken, definitely. But you know what? I guess when I look at someone like that, or someone that feels very emboldened, to communicate that way, I also look at, they had the trickle-down economics. I'm looking at the trickle-down style of politics these days, and I think that really affects how our local representatives deal with things, whether they're Republican or Democrat. And you look at sort of the mothership, and it affects how you deal with things, because maybe a few years ago this individual may not have felt emboldened to be able to do that.
Right.
It's empowerment in a different direction, unfortunately. You've really championed a lot of different. You know what? I want to get your take on the governorship.
Sure.
You had mentioned the individual, Colbeck. So there's Governor Abdus Sayed. We have Shri Tanadar and Gretchen Whitmer on the Democratic side. What's your take on that, and what do you see for the future?
So,
as much as you can.
Yeah, of course, of course. So I'm one of the few elected officials that hasn't made an official endorsement for the governor's race this year, and so I won't be doing that today on the show either. But I will say that
I tried.
Yeah, you tried. What I will say is that some additional polling came out today in the governor's race, and it looks like Senator Whitmer has a pretty substantial lead going into the election on August 7th. I think we've seen, at least on the Democratic side of the aisle, this big debate over, sort of who we are as Democrats, and what do we believe in, and how left are we, or how liberal, how progressive are we? And what I think is so beautiful about our party in particular, we fancy ourselves as a big tent party, and so we think that, or we say that, we have sort of room for diversity of thought as much as any other type of diversity in the party as well. And so certainly Abdul El Sayed is a much more progressive, I think, candidate when it comes to some of the policy matters than maybe some of his other counterparts. If he comes up short on August 7th, I don't think that you immediately cast someone like that aside. I think that he absolutely has a place within the future of the party and talking about and advancing issues that people are passionate about. When you look at Gretchen Whitmer's record, certainly she has a very progressive record as well as a state senator. She was the former leader of the Senate Democratic Caucus, and she has experience in Lansing in getting some of these things done and across the finish line, advancing the expansion of Medicaid, for example, here in the state of Michigan. And then Shri, I will tell you this, my mother says if you don't have anything nice to say, don't say anything at all. So I'll probably just gloss over Shri. I just get frustrated when people have millions and millions of dollars in their pocket and they think that they can throw it around to try and buy an election. I don't think that that's what our elections are supposed to be about here in Michigan. So his candidacy gives me some pause.
Very well said. Very well said. I do have to, I guess, add my 2 cents. I've met both Abdul Sayed and Gretchen Whitmer, and I think they both have a very solid focus and a very solid platform. But I just love the passion and the commitment, and again, sort of reminds me a little of your passion and commitment to do the right thing. And I had Abdul in the studio not too long ago, and he just was sincere. He knew what he wanted to do, and he knew why he wanted to do it. And I think that's extremely refreshing.
Sure.
When you look at the political platform these days. So, best of luck to all of them, and we'll see what happens
just a few
in
more
our
days,
primaries.
15 more days.
Almost. Yeah, a little over 2 weeks. You've really championed a lot of things. We're almost running out of time here, but
it always goes so quick.
I know it does.
Yeah.
We need to do this more often, though. There's so many things to talk to you about because you are one of the most active senators out there. We look at education, which is really something that is so important. These are our children. These are our future, basically, as Whitney Houston would say, right? And you look at education, and we are failing miserably, especially in Michigan. I don't think we have not always been in that state, but we are failing miserably. We're taking away a lot of the funding. The expectations are getting higher, and we are setting our schools up for failure, basically. So what is happening on the Senate floor? What is happening in Lansing that is creating this horrible shift of failure for our students? And statistically speaking, it's not just the emotional kind of cloud that you look in terms of teacher salary, dollars per student. It is statistically written in stone that we are failing
right.
our kids. So what are we doing with
that?
Yeah,
and unfortunately, we just got a new report back last week that said Michigan is the only state in the country that is in need of remediation when it comes to the services that we're giving to special needs students or students with disabilities. And so, in my time in Lansing, when we first came in, there were massive cuts that were taking place within the school aid fund and the school aid budget, specifically when it came to shifting dollars out of the classroom and towards other expenses that Governor Snyder had wanted to cover. And so, when it comes to education, at the end of the day, you get what you pay for.
Are we privatizing education, like and shifting more into corporate charter schools?
Yeah.
And I call them corporate charters because
some are
people are making right.
Yeah. And I think the short answer is probably yes, in that over the past few years, we used to have a cap on the number of charter schools here in the state of Michigan. They removed that cap, and you've just seen this complete explosion of charter schools across the entire state. And we've gotten to a point now where things are so saturated. It's not just a charter school popping up next to a public school, siphoning away those students and those dollars with them. They're popping up next to other charter schools and trying to cannibalize each other. And so when you have that system of education that sees the student solely as a dollar sign instead of an actual child
right,
that you have a responsibility towards, that for me is a really big problem. And so there are things that we can be doing at the state level to increase that investment again. What frustrates me is over my 6 years in office now, there was massive cuts in year one, and then they start to increase a little bit every subsequent year after that and act as if it's some sort of a big win. What I always likened it to is, you've dug me a 10-foot hole and given me a 5-foot ladder.
Right.
And so, I appreciate the
and
ladder.
Look what I'm giving to you, but
right,
look what you
right,
took away.
Right.
So,
and I'm still not able to get
balance.
to where I was at in the past. You look at a school like Wayne State University, for example, less funding today than they did back in 2010. And so when we talk about education, certainly funding is a large part of it. Being able to attract teachers into the classroom is another part of that as well, and making sure that when students are there, they have the books and the supplies that they need to be successful. I don't think Michigan's stepped up in the way that we need to, but we're going to keep fighting for that moving forward.
Absolutely. Also, we've got just one more minute here, but I wanted to also let people know that you got the $550 million that was withheld from public school employees, 3% tax on the pension, and teachers got that back because of your hard work. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
And there's a gamut of things that you've worked on, and you've been very, very, very successful in doing. The statute of limitations, that's huge for sexual assault. You've changed that from 3 years to 10 years. So congratulations on that huge win. What do you want to say to the voters?
To the voters,
yes.
huh?
What would you like to say to the voters?
I would just say the last 6 years have been just absolutely amazing for me serving this community, especially because it's my community. Having grown up here, went to St. Linus, went to Crestwood High School. I love this job. but we still have a whole lot more work to do. And trying to fight for more jobs, increase pay and benefits. I believe in healthcare for all, and I think that we have an opportunity to push that here at the state level. I would just ask for folks to look at my record over the last 6 years, and when they go to the voting booth this August, give me a good hard look, and if I can earn your vote, I'd love to have it.
Absolutely. Well, your record speaks for itself, and you're the kind of guy that puts those sleeves up and goes to work. Thank you so much for being with us. I really appreciate it, and I love our conversations, and you always have amazing things that you've accomplished every time you come back. So thank you. David Knezek, and thank you all for joining us on Off the Cuff. We'll see you next time.